Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. Great to have you with us on the program. As mentioned, our special guest today is Michael C. White. He's the author of the new book, Resting Places, A Woman's Journey of Self-Discovery and Spiritual Awakening. Michael is the author of 6 previous novels, including Beautiful Assassin, which won the 2011 Connecticut Book Award for fiction, and Soulcatcher, which was a Booksense and Historical Novels review selection. He's also published a collection of stories, Marked Men, the founding editor of the fiction anthologies American Fiction and Dogwood. And he also was director of the Fairfield University's MFA in Creative Writing program. Award-winning author Michael C. White with us on This Week in America. Michael, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Rick, thanks for having me.
This is an excellent book, and it's a journey, as I mentioned, a woman's journey of self-discovery and spiritual awakening. We'll talk about how this all fit together, but what this idea actually started, I understand, with you years ago in traveling and seeing these roadside memorials that we all see and have questions about.
Yes, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was driving through New Hampshire, and I saw a roadside memorial, and I had passed it a couple of times. And many of my novels begin with the question, what if, or why, or how. And the what if was, and the why was, why do people put up these roadside memorials? So I stopped, and I saw there was a young man who had died. He had been a father and a son, and his relatives put up a cross, and they put up a fishing pole and some lures, and obviously he was a fisherman. And I wondered not only about the man who died, but about the people who put it up, and there began my journey of a novel.
It's interesting. You said with cemeteries, they're sort of neat, they're off, and we understand that's death as we look over in that direction. The memorials are right in your face, and you can't help but as you drive by and you're thinking, at one point, someone like me, or maybe my child that drives this road frequently, is just driving this road, and suddenly their life is taken.
Yes, I think there's a distinct difference between roadside memorials and cemeteries. When I started this journey of this novel, I had the same kind of question, same kind of response that most people do. Why do people do this? Why isn't a cemetery good enough? But as I started to research it and I started to stop at roadside memorial after roadside memorial, hundreds, I started to ask the question, what's the difference? And one of the differences is that these roadside memorials are not hidden the way cemeteries are. They're not segmented. They're not sectioned off into ghettos of the dead, if you will. They're right in your face. It's where people died, and more than that, it's where people come to remember their dead in ways that cemeteries cannot do.
You know, it's interesting because you actually, in the book, Elizabeth takes this cross-country journey to find the place where her son died and sees these roadside memorials as she's driving across the country. You actually went across the country with a friend and stopped to look at these, and it's fascinating because some, as you mentioned, just have a name, maybe the date of the accident, and others really tell sort of a story, don't they?
They do, and I did go across country, and I drove, as Elizabeth does, and I did it for research, from Connecticut to north central New Mexico. And along the way, she stopped at dozens of these roadside memorials, as did I. And for instance, one of the roadside memorials we stopped at had this 2 similar names. There were 4 crosses, so I looked it up, I Googled it, and I found out there was a death there of 2 fathers and 2 sons, a very tragic kind of incident. Another one was of a large cross and a small cross, and the 2 people who died here had the same last name. They both had the same death dates, but only the larger one had a birthday. And I started wondering, what does that mean? And it suddenly dawned on me, a man, that a woman who was pregnant died here, and her unborn child died at this spot. And it's very kind of tragic, and yet it was a narrative, and most of these roadside memorials do indeed, as you suggested, tell stories.
The book is called Resting Places. It's a woman's journey of self-discovery and spiritual awakening. Excellently reviewed. It's available all across the country. Information you can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Michael's website is michaelchwhite.com. Books available all across the country, and it deals in the world of parental loss. And I understand you've never experienced that, but had what sort of a close call at one point with one of your sons, and you thought maybe he was missing.
Well, a couple of things. I have an older brother who did lose 2 of his children, one to a car accident, so I did have that
Yes.
direct but indirect experience. And in my own life, as in the lives of many parents throughout America, we've lost our children if for moments in our lives. We were in Wales traveling by ferry from Wales to Ireland, and our 9-year-old son disappeared for probably 15 frightening minutes. But it was the most frightening minutes of my life, and I used that in the prologue.
The book is called Resting Places. The author is Michael C. White. He's our guest on This Week in America talking about the book. The main character in the book is a very complex lady, Elizabeth. Talk about her, and what is really striking is this really is a genuine lady. The portrait that you develop here is she's a very complex lady, but she's very real because of that.
That's a good point, Rick. Elizabeth has lots of issues. She's very bright. She's very stubborn, but she's also weak in some areas, and she doesn't like to admit to those weaknesses. Unlike her husband, who's very religious, she is not. And I like to think of this book as a deeply spiritual book of a woman's journey towards her own sense of spirituality, and she has to go on this long physical journey across country to understand herself, her son, and her own spirituality.
Her and her husband handled the death of their son, Luke, who's 21, dies in a car accident in New Mexico, in different ways. He belongs to a support group. He's relying on his faith to get him through. Elizabeth, what turns to something else to get her through?
Yeah, her husband believes faith will get him through, and for him, that's an answer. He loves his child. He's has great remorse over the death of their child, but he's ready to move on. And Elizabeth is not, and she relies on the bottle. She drinks too much. She is throwing herself into her women's support group, where she is a legal advocate for women who are abused. She finds solace in that. And by chance, she meets a man alongside the road.
Yeah, and talk about that, because that really changes her life. That starts this whole road of Elizabeth's transformation.
That's a good point. I like to think that in all my novels and in most novels, there's a point where a character changes and the inertia of that character bends him or her in a different way. Elizabeth is driving home one night after spending time at the women's center where she works, helping women. And it's pouring rain, and she happens to see a truck pulled over on the side of the road. And there's a man off to the right of the truck, kneeling down in the high grass. She starts to pass it, and then she thinks, what if something bad has happened? What if there's been an accident? What if somebody has been killed? And somewhere in the back of her mind, she's probably thinking of her child. So she stops, and she gets out of the car, and she goes over to the man. And lo and behold, he's kneeling down in front of one of those roadside memorials, the cross, and he's praying.
The book is Resting Places. Michael C. White, the award-winning author, is the author of this book. It's his 7th book. It's available all across the country. Information, of course, available at our website. You can link on directly by going to thisweekinamerica.us. As she's doing this, she discovers so much about herself, and it's interesting because she's dealing with pain, and she's also dealing with guilt as well, isn't she?
Yeah, she has a double whammy, if you will. She feeling terrible pain for losing her child, and she feels great guilt because on the night of his death, he had called her, and he said there was something very important he wanted to tell her. And she isn't able to take his call because of something that's going on. I won't get into that because I don't want to give too much of it away, but she feels great guilt for not taking his call and not understanding what he wanted to ask her. So part of the novel is about understanding what he wanted to ask her and trying to come to some grips with the great guilt she feels over his death.
It's interesting, and I mentioned before that she's really a genuine character and goes through experiences that I think as parents we all can relate to. Late teen, she starts sort of losing touch with him, and as she's in New Mexico and on this quest, she finds she has to learn and unlearn some things about him. I think we all as parents go through that as that separation grows and children are developing their own lives. It's not quite the same, is it, as it was when they were junior high kids and living at home and you knew everything that was going on with them.
A great point. As a parent of 2 kids, and knock on wood, my kids are alive and healthy. But as all parents, we have to come to some kind of understanding about our children. And I think it's an understanding that we keep having to come to. We have to keep relearning who they are. And at one point in the book, somebody would ask her, "What is your kid doing?" And the answer would have been, "He goes to this school, he plays the instrument, or he plays sports, or he's going to this college." And that all those things no longer mean anything to her. When asked, "What is her son?" she has to think, who is he, and what was he, and what did he want, and what were his dreams in life and goals. And she had to, as you put it, unlearn who he was and how she looked at her son and rethink who he was.
And part of this process, this transformation, she sort of what saw her husband's faith as maybe sort of an addiction. She had alcohol, she had faith, he had faith, and sort of saw them in similar fashion. She realizes that this faith is pretty important and can get me through a lot of situations.
Yeah, and I think she looked at his faith as an easy answer,
Yes,
kind of a canned answer to a problem, and for many people that's a great answer, and it's an important and viable one. For her, it's not, and she has to. And I think most people have to find their own path to faith, and that faith may be in a more traditional religion. It may be in something else. I think she, by going on this quest and stopping at the roadside memorials and running into a couple of men who are almost her guides in this journey of faith and spirituality, she has to learn from them.
and she realizes that faith, having this belief, is actually good for times other than when you're going through loss and pain.
Yeah, and I think many people, when they lean on their faith or their religion, do so in moments of great pain or great suffering. And I think what Elizabeth learns is that you need faith throughout your days in some kind of way or other, both in the good times and the bad times. And she sees it both in her son and through her son. And ironically, his quest and her quest are parallel quests. Her son, his life forms a kind of mystery that she has to try to unravel. His death is a mystery, and her journey is striving at an answer.
With us on This Week in America, Michael C. White. He's the author of the book Resting Places, A Woman's Journey of Self-Discovery and Spiritual Awakening. In one of the reviews, Wally Lamb, and we've had Wally on the program before talking about a TV adaptation of one of his books, says Elizabeth is a character I will long remember, and Resting Places is a story I will not soon forget. This was such a powerful, inspirational book. I wonder, from your standpoint, will you quickly forget Elizabeth or forget the story? As an author, can you just sort of like close the chapter on that and move on to something else, or does that stay with you?
Well, I think it does both. I mean, as a writer, I'm moving on. I've already finished a new novel set in Berlin in 1936 during the Olympics. But I've been doing lots of readings for Resting Places, so it's almost schizophrenic. I go back and forth. But Elizabeth is somebody I think about whenever I see a roadside memorial. Just the other night at a reading, one of the questions I ask my audience is typically, how many people have seen a roadside memorial? And everybody raises their hand. And then I ask the question, how many people have stopped at a roadside memorial? And maybe nobody, or maybe one person will raise their hand. And Elizabeth is that kind of daring soul who dared not only stop at one, but many.
The book is Resting Places. Michael C. White, the author, our guest on the program. A couple minutes left in the program. I'd like to talk about a technique you use called empathetic imagination. Talk about that, because I'm sure the question is, where do you get these characters? How do you develop these characters? Talk about the process you use to develop your characters.
Excellent point. When I talk to my writing students or to people interested in writing or reading novels, I talk about empathetic imagination. And by that, I mean a writer has to enter into the lives of his characters, and they may be radically different. They may, in one other novel, there was a woman who was a Russian female sniper of World War II. Elizabeth is somebody that is not necessarily close to my heart or my mind, but I had to enter into her life. And empathetic imagination is that you're using empathy the way we do in understanding other people's lives. I wish more of us did that every day in our lives. But the imagination allows us not only to enter into, but to live that life. and to see where she goes. And that's the writer part of it.
Every author seems to have little tricks, personal tricks of the trade. I understand yours is a converted chicken coop where you can go and you're by yourself and like, okay, I'm now the spirit is right. I can write at this particular point in time.
Having being the son of a carpenter and a farmer, a chicken coop is something that it's dear to my heart. I go out there. It's about 100 yards into the woods. We have about 7 acres. But I'm not alone. I bring my 2 Labradors, and they serve as my muse out there. So it's quiet. They sleep around me, and I write.
How much fun is it creating characters and worlds different than yours and different times as well? You talk about the book you're working on. That's what I think the 1936 Berlin Olympics, back to a whole other era. How much fun is that, creating a world that's totally existent only in your mind, and then going back and doing the research and sort of putting yourself back in that time period?
I think that's one of the great things about being a writer. My father was a great oral storyteller, and as a little boy, I used to listen to him go into a bar, and he would talk to other men who were carpenters and plumbers, and he would entertain them with stories. And I used to love how he could do that and make up entire worlds. What I find remarkable is where these stories take me, both emotionally, intellectually, on the gut level, on the head level, and then I do research to try to make them real.
You've been, in most of the reviews I read, you're called basically a masterful storyteller, and it's interesting that goes back to the time with your father. How difficult is it to get just the right narrative? You don't want to overdo it because it's like, wow, this is way too descriptive. I don't need this information. But as I'm reading, I've got just enough that I know exactly what's happening, and I feel like I'm in that world. How difficult is it to find that sweet spot?
It's a very difficult thing. Too little, and you don't get the feel
Right.
of the place and the time, the fictional landscape too much, and you bog down the story and the characters.
Michael C. White, our guest on This Week in America. The book we're talking about is Resting Places, A Woman's Journey of Self-Discovery and Spiritual Awakening. It's his 7th and latest novel. Well, I say that, we'll hopefully have Michael back to talk about novel number 8. Are you ready for print with that?
My agent loved the novel, and I'm making some revisions. I'll be sending it back to him shortly.
We will stay in touch, and we'll talk about that when the appropriate time is. Right now, we're talking about Resting Places. Michael's website is michaelcwhite.com. The book's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all across the country, and you can link on and get more information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Michael, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I thank you so much. This has been fun. Thank you for taking time to be with us on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, the name of the book, Resting Places. The author is Michael C. White. You're listening to This Week in America. Website, thisweekinamerica.us.